I started getting into private equity, passive investing in 2013, sort of post-Jobs Act, where we started seeing a lot more information. What I'm really curious about is for yourself, starting in 2002, how did you start learning about private equity and this type of investing to begin with?
After the dot-com crash back in 2001, I was just kind of sick and tired of the stock market for two reasons. One is that the volatility was not the right fit for me. So watching the market go up and down 30% in a year was the wrong fit for me. And the other was the lack of predictability of where my retirement account would be in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, given that volatility. What I kind of concluded was that the stock market wasn't the best fit for me. I started to look at different ways to invest, and I came across the concept of focusing on cash flow, potentially through real estate, also through other assets. And so I started to learn back in 2002 by a combination of networking, and I was also very lucky because longtime friends of my family, who I literally grew up with since I was 4 or 5, their father syndicating properties and like buying these types of assets already for 10, 20 years at that point. So it was in Canada. I grew up in Montreal, spent half my life there, half my life in the US where I am now. And I started to invest in Canada, but from the US where I was living, because I had a very good long-standing relationship with them and I thought I could trust them, but also I'd be able to learn from them to a different degree than an average sponsor. So that's how I started to test the waters. And then I started to network. And of course, as you alluded to before, back then, especially with like the internet, apps, Jobs Act, so many things have happened in the last 20 plus years. It was a totally different landscape. There's a whole bunch of things that are important that probably aren't obvious. Like it's not just about taking the business plan and reading it and making a decision. If you want to really try to optimize, there's more to it for sure.
Some of those key skills and really focusing on the operator, I think is a huge takeaway, because ultimately when you have economic headwinds, when you have challenges, it's going to be the operator that's going to have to navigate this asset, this business plan through these things. So that's the priority. I also know that going through the math, the underwriting, and vetting all of the assumptions, right? Because ultimately the math is driven by the assumptions. And I think this is where I've seen some people get it wrong, because they're like, oh, let me look at the end result. Okay, let's back up and go, what's driving the end result? It's usually a core set of assumptions, as you just called out. And that's really the rich conversation to have with the operator, is understanding what are those assumptions and why, is then you go double check and you say, what's different sources of data that can back up that math that's going to give me a level of comfort that that's the truth.
Even how you dissect the assumptions is important, because it can tell you, again, intangible things. Some operators will say, okay, I'm using a 3% expense inflation. And what they'll do is they'll take every single row of expenses and they'll just multiply it by 1.03, right? Easy math. But some of them will say, okay, I'm using 3% expense inflation, except medical health insurance is going up at 8% a year. So I'm actually going to adjust that line, right? And snow removal has been going up at 5% per year. Now they'd still keep certain things at that 3% level because those are the standard ones, but they'll go in and actually make all these tweaks. That tells you, okay, I'm dealing with someone who is more detail oriented. And when they're going to be on the ground running the property, they're going to be more detail oriented, right? So it's not just a question of taking an expense ratio and saying, okay, I'm investing in apartments at 45%. It looks about right. The expenses, right? Just the bottom line looks right. Everything looks like it's reasonable. If you really want to optimize, you got to get into like the real nitty gritty of that.
Ultimately, the devil's in the details, meaning that, how that operator is going to operate the property is going to be in that level of detail. And I think it's important for people to understand is this portfolio is your income. And so the reason that you are so conservative is because that's going to be the check that pays you. You are ultimately this conservative, and your focus when it comes to real estate, private equity investing is on cash flow. You're not investing for appreciation, for anything that in this core part of your portfolio.
I tell people, look, there's 1,000 ways to invest. None of them are wrong. It's a question of personality fit. Frankly, people who invest in literally land deals or just ground up developments, I've never invested in one ever. They may do better than me long-term on a return basis, right? But I'm looking for that predictable cash flow because I literally want to go to sleep tonight, wake up tomorrow. Not much has changed because I live off the cash flow. And so that's my profile. And that's what makes me be very specific about how I'm reviewing all these things.
As you got started in this, what were some of the key indicators that you saw, wait, I can actually do this full time?
There's a lot of people I talk to in corporate world, and I was in the corporate world for over 10 years. Just you guys know who were listening, my last 2 jobs were at Disney headquarters and Toyota headquarters. So I've worked with some big companies. And my intention in going into this type of investing was never to get out of the corporate world and never to generate the cash flow to get out of the corporate world. It was actually to have the W-2 and the more predictable retirement side that was growing. I didn't actually have a plan to get out. I didn't say, okay, it's a 5-year, 10-year plan like a lot of people do, which is fantastic. I actually had a last straw moment with my manager when I got promoted into a new division, and I just couldn't deal with, this whole new situation. And so I actually had enough cash flow built up to live off of if I wanted to use it, but it was being used to reinvest in, et cetera. And so I kind of took a risk and left the corporate corporate world as a result. I will tell you that one of the metrics that I used at the time, I was just above a 2x cash flow versus cost of living. And that to me was very important because I'm very conservative. And so if some of it stops, you're still okay. I didn't have a plan and design this whole thing. So it's not like what a lot of people do.